Call your sponsor. Call your sponsor. Call you sponsor. Call your sponsor. Call you.
Bitch, call your sponsor.
Call your.
Welcome back to Bitch Call Your Sponsor. I'm Misty.
Hi, Misty. I'm Sam.
Hello, Sam. Let's do our primary purpose. Our primary purpose is for Misty and Sam to grow their friendship and maybe help others. Okay, well, the topic that I picked for us today is willingness, which is very apropos because today, do I have the willingness to get up and pick a topic and find out what the hell willingness has to do with anything? And I was willing. So in step 6, chapter 6 in the 12 and 12, it explores the concept of willingness in detail. It talks about the need for entire willingness, which I think is ironic because willingness is just, I feel like willingness is like a maybe. It's like, maybe I'm willing to take a look at this in a different way. So entire maybe sounds weird to me. But entire willingness to have defects of character removed and how this willingness is necessary for personal growth and transformation. And yeah, I find that willingness for me is kind of my hit the knees moment of like, okay, I'm willing to look at this. Like Marianne says, a miracle is a shift in perspective. So what about you?
Oh my gosh, I have a lot to talk about.
Oh, good.
And I'm in the same boat. I think I'm just on a halt. It's like I'm just tired. So willingness, what irks me is, and I know it's an expression and it's said in our literature, God willing. I had a sponsor along my way that always used to turn to me and say, God's always willing. Are you willing?
That's good.
Yeah, I totally get this, like hitting a bottom, like, and another sponsor that used to say, like, they never ran to the light of enlightenment. They ran from the flames of disaster.
I mean, were your previous sponsors Socrates? Like, what the hell, dude? These are like dropping gold bombs here. I love that one. Can you say that one again?
Yeah, I never ran to the light of enlightenment. I would run from the flames of disaster. Kind of like the whole thing of like, in 3, it's like anything I've let go of didn't have my claw marks on it.
Right. It's just a fancier way of saying it, which I like.
Yeah. So yeah, sometimes I just need to feel the pain in order for me to then become willing, I think part of me for 6 is like there's a certain essence of like acting as if, and sometimes I'm just like, but I don't wanna,
Yeah. And I think willingness goes with that, like it's like, for me, what it looks like is situation occurs. I don't want to accept it. I'm trying to figure out my under it, over it, sideways, everything but through it. And then I feel the pain of it. And then I'm willing to keep going forward, but I can still be in the pain and be willing to keep going forward.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think the thing that's coming up for me is the figuring out, God of intellect versus then hitting a bottom with my brain and then literally asking for help from a higher power and praying.
Right. And I feel like that willingness, it's a good word to be like, especially when I feel that rebelliousness with I can't. And I would say this with people that I sponsored. They'd be like, I'm never making amends to that person. And I'm like, okay, that's totally cool. You don't have to. Are you willing to make amends to that person? And sometimes they're like, no. And I'm like, great. Okay. We'll check back in a couple of years. Because it's okay to be like, no. And then that willingness, sometimes you can see somebody's face change when you go, okay, I get that. But are you willing to forgive them? And you can just see their face and their whole spirit go, it almost takes the percentage from 100% down to 98%.
I sometimes say, thank you so much for the suggestion. I'm not willing, nor am I willing to be willing to pray for the willingness.
Oh, yes. Love it.
And I think that's at the core of it, right? Is that I'm honest with myself, to thy own self be true, and to another, exactly where I am, and
I agree.
Sometimes time takes time with some of these things.
And I always say this, but another one of my favorite parts in the big book is when it says the purpose of this book, and I'm not going to quote it correctly, but it's basically saying the purpose of this book is for you to have a relationship with yourself and a higher power that you can depend on. And that's it.
Yeah.
And I think knowing yourself and knowing when it's like, no, willingness we're not there, and it's not coming there, and back off. And when it's like, okay, I'm willing to be willing to be willing. And it's also when it talks about in the 12 and 12, when it says, the hard part is finding a chink in the armor for this person, and I feel like that's where the willingness, when you're like, oh, okay, I'm willing.
6, it's just coming back to me. I remember thinking like, the perfectionist little perfectionist gremlin likes to come out every now and then, a lot less than when I first started coming around the rooms, but it's still there. And, there is this part in 6 in the 12 and 12 that talks about he doesn't render us white as snow, right? Where I'm still human, and I think a lot of this for me is embracing my humanness.
Right.
Because I grew up in perfectionism, and I, anything short of perfection isn't worth it, is like kind of the vibe that I grew up with. And that's not really helpful these days.
Right. This is so interesting. I love this because in chapter 3 and more about alcoholism, it talks about the importance of being willing. It states, half measures availed us nothing, and emphasizes the need for complete willingness to go to any lengths for recovery. And so this is another one of those things where it's like when you come from different perspectives. So I was always a half measures girl. Like that's how I grew up. My mom grew up like, you did 20%. Or no, for her, she did 20%. Everything was fine, And so it was always half measures. And for me, I don't come from the perfectionist background, right? So my thing was trying to be willing to get over my half measuresness. And
oh, go ahead.
No, that's it.
I'm just thinking there's a lot of contradictions, because also I think in Dr. Bob's story, it says if we just, apply ourselves with one half the zeal that we did when we were out there using, we'll be able to get something.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's a million contradictions. There's a million. We could do an episode on not all the contradictions.
And depending upon how I feel and what I remember in the day, I will use any one of those to justify why just whatever. Like what I've heard you say before is like finding a ditch and decorating, to justify why I'm staying in that ditch.
Right. Well, and I keep thinking, I love when this woman spoke a couple of weeks ago and she said, if you stay around long enough, you're going to have a couple of flattenings in AA. And to me, the willingness comes after these big flattenings. You know, it doesn't come before them. That's for sure. And oh my God, I heard the most beautiful thing yesterday, basically about when you're going through these things, there's a part of you that called it, and it's rejoicing basically when we're going through these turmoils and troubles, because it called it to us. And so that might help with the willingness, but then again, sometimes no, absolutely not. I don't want to hear I called it to me. I don't want to say thank you.
Yeah, I think pain has definitely been the motivator for me with a lot of things, you know. It's like I even like my procrastination stuff, like it just needs to wait until the end till it's like, oh my God. And you know, I don't know how many times I've procrastinated, a zillion times at this point in my life. And every time I'm like pressed for time with whatever deadline, I always tell myself, this is the last time. Like, what was I doing with all the time I had before? And this could have been so much better than me waiting until now, you know? And I like forfeited all this time. There's this whole like guilt trip I do. And then it ends up being the same thing, different day, a lot of the time. In school, it ended up being with papers, in program, it ended up being, especially around my fourth step. I mean, it just took what it took. I mean, I spent a lot of time finding the perfect pen, the perfect pad, the perfect, you know, that whole perfectionism thing. You know, am I going to do it by the questions in the 12 and 12? Or am I going to, you know, go to this workshop and do it how it is in the big book? Or, you know what I mean? And then I like, it just, yeah. So procrastination. And then today, you know, with time, it's like, you know, I think I shared in the past, like, you know, I'm on the job hunt and, you know, the runway is definitely getting a lot shorter. And now I'm just like, okay, now we're going, you know, pedal to the metal, you know? Whereas before it's like, oh, and then, you know, the other side of that is what's coming up is, oh, you know, at first I was like, oh, I'm not attached to anything. I'm fine, you know? And now that I'm getting closer to the end of the runway, when things are looking really real, I'm like, I'm still attached to these things.
Right. Right. I totally get that. Totally get that. Yeah, exactly. And that's, I'm the same way. Like, that is another thing. I mean, that's one thing we definitely have in common where I'm like, procrastinate, and then pray. Oh, it's due on this day. I can't wait to get started early on it. I just did that with the writing thing where it was a month away before I was going to present my writing to a group. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this differently. As soon as we got off the first call and I knew I had 30 days to do the assignment, I was like, I'm going to start early because the more you work on your draft, the better it gets. And I want to give the best paper. And then like a week goes by, I'm like, oh yeah, I really need to start on that. And then another week goes by and I'm like, man, I really want to start. And then the third week goes by and I completely forgot about it. And I ended up doing it 2 days before the, before the group was reading it. And you know what? It turned out amazing. And that's the problem for me with procrastination is that I do it and it turns out amazing. So it doesn't support me having willingness to change.
That's interesting because there actually is a TED Talk. Should maybe link it to this. That is about procrastination and the brilliance of procrastination. And it's looking at the lens of how a creative, by procrastinating, they're really able to get there, whether or not they realize it or not, they are actually with that space, productive, whether they're focusing on it or not, because it's allowing space for other things to percolate.
I love that. Obviously, we do need to link it. But
Yeah, I need credit.
but it reminds me that willingness is a sort of surrender, where I just go, okay, well, I'm willing to do it early. And it doesn't mean I'm going to.
Your sponsor.
Call you
Your
sponsor.
sponsor.
Call you
Call
sponsor.
your
Call you
sponsor.
sponsor. Call you.
Bitch, call your sponsor.
Call your sponsor. Call your
New episode tomorrow. Send us an email bcysponsor@gmail.com.